When you board a flight, there's an unspoken understanding that no matter who you are or where you're from, you're entitled to the same level of care and respect as everyone else in the cabin. It's one of those few spaces where the rules of fairness, equality, and professionalism are supposed to be strictly upheld. But what if those rules were broken in broad daylight, brazenly, unapologetically, and it happened to someone who dared to push back? What if one single moment of blatant mistreatment spiraled into a wave of consequences that no one could have seen coming? This is the story of one woman, a flight attendant who underestimated the power of human dignity, and how one phone call turned a routine flight into a headline-worthy scandal. It started like any other day for Kendra, a 34-year-old woman on her way to Atlanta for a work conference. Kendra wasn't just any passenger, though. On first glance, you'd notice her radiant energy, a rare confidence that only comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. Dressed in a simple but elegant outfit, she carried herself with unmatched poise, even as she tucked her hardcover book into the seat pocket and adjusted her headphones. Kendra wasn't expecting anything extraordinary on this flight. She had no idea her name would soon be etched into the memories of every member of that cabin crew, and not for reasons one would celebrate. From the moment she boarded, Kendra had the sense that something wasn't quite right. The flight attendant, assigned to her section, Victoria, gave off a cold, dismissive vibe. At first, Kendra brushed it off. After all, everyone has their off days, right? Victoria seemed stressed as she rushed up and down the narrow aisle, placing bags into overhead bins, rattling off instructions without making eye contact, not once cracking a smile. Kendra decided not to make anything of it. No need to create a problem where there wasn't one. Or so she thought. It wasn't until drinks and snacks were being served that the shift in tone became impossible to ignore. Everyone in Kendra's row had been served in an orderly manner. Tiny packets of pretzels, carefully poured cans of soda, polite smiles given to passengers. But when it came to Kendra's turn, things came to a screeching halt. She politely asked for the menu to see what other options might be available. It was a long flight, and she preferred to know what she could order before making a decision. Without pausing to think, Victoria leaned down. Her voice, a mixture of sharpness and pity, filled the air around them. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have menus for you today." The emphasis on the word "you" cut through like a knife in an otherwise polite cadence. At first, Kendra thought she misheard. She blinked twice, waiting for some explanation that would soften the sting of those words. But Victoria simply straightened her posture and moved on, addressing the next passenger with the same warmth she had reserved for everyone but Kendra. The air around the two of them turned thick, almost suffocating. Ice-cold resentment settled into Kendra's chest. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Surely nobody would act so boldly, so recklessly without reason. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that the slight was no accident. Kendra looked at the passengers sitting near her, searching their faces for confirmation of what just happened, wondering if anyone else had registered the moment. Were her black experiences playing tricks on her again, making her see prejudice where none existed, or was this as clear as day? Her mind raced, but her face, calm and steady, betrayed none of her internal conflict. Years of navigating situations like this had taught her to temper herself. Too much pushback could mean being labeled angry. Too little could mean letting this behavior slide like it never happened. She reached up to press the call button. This wasn't over. The flight attendant returned quickly, but her demeanor was colder than before. Kendra, keeping her tone professional but firm, asked for clarification. "Can you explain why I wasn't given access to the menu?" Victoria's response was curt, laced with thinly veiled indifference. "We don't have anything else to offer." This conversation is over. Please don't press your call button again." That's when it hit Kendra. This wasn't a misstep or a misunderstanding. This was intentional, and something had to be done. She could feel her pulse quicken as she weighed her next move. Around her, passengers were starting to take notice. Some averted their gazes as if pretending not to see, while others shot her sympathetic looks. The energy in the cabin was shifting, even before anyone said a word. Whoever thought this would be a passing moment underestimated the depth of Kendra's resilience. She wasn't about to cause a scene. No, that wasn't her style. But she also wasn't one to be silently walked over. She knew standing up for herself in that moment was not just about her. It was about something bigger. Reaching into the pocket of her jacket, Kendra pulled out her phone. Her hands were steady as she navigated to her contacts and placed a call. With one press of a button, she connected with someone whose influence far exceeded anything Victoria could have guessed. The conversation was brief but firm. Words were exchanged that Kendra knew would turn the tides of this story. And when she ended the call, she slipped her phone back into her pocket, leaned back into her chair, and stared directly at Victoria. It wasn't a look of anger. It was the kind of quiet, knowing confidence that comes when you already know the consequences of someone's actions are inevitable. Victoria, unaware of exactly what had just unfolded, continued her duties as though the incident were a minor inconvenience. But as Kendra sat back, a quiet storm brewing beneath her calm exterior, the tension in the cabin hung heavy. Something was coming, and no one, not the crew, not the passengers, not Victoria herself, would have anticipated what happened next. Stay tuned, because when I tell you this flight took a turn no one could have predicted, I truly mean it. TC. Cabin hummed with quiet activity as Kendra stared out the small window at the endless blue sky. Outwardly, she was calm, her posture relaxed and unbothered. But internally, her mind was looping through the events of the past 20 minutes, piecing them together like a jigsaw puzzle that seemed both too clear and too outrageous to believe. The arrogance, the audacity. Had Victoria really thought she could get away with treating her like she was invisible, like she didn't matter, or worse, like she didn't belong? A faint murmur rippled through the rows around her as passengers whispered to one another, their voices too low to make out. Kendra was sure of one thing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. That phone call she'd made, it wasn't just for show. It was a deliberate move, sparked by years of accumulated frustration and an unshakable belief in her own worth. She wasn't the type to seek confrontation, but sometimes it found her anyway. Sometimes life drew a line in the sand and dared you to step over it. It hadn't always been this way for Kendra. Growing up in a small southern town, she'd learned early on how to walk the tightrope of other people's expectations. Being a young black girl in spaces where she was often the only one like her meant constantly having to prove herself, even when it wasn't fair. Blend in but still stand out. Speak up but don't seem loud. Be excellent but don't act like you know it. It was exhausting, but over time it gave her the kind of grace under pressure that most people could only admire from a distance. And that grace, that ability to keep her cool, even in the most infuriating of moments, was serving her now as she played the waiting game. Meanwhile, behind the curtain separating first class from coach, the flight crew was beginning to sense the unease spreading through the cabin. It was subtle at first, a shared glance here, a questioning look there, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Victoria, however, remained oblivious, or perhaps she had convinced herself that being firm with Kendra had been the right call, that whatever fallout came of it wouldn't affect her. After all, she'd been flying for years. She knew how to handle people, didn't she? Difficult passengers were part of the job. If anything, she probably thought she'd put Kendra in her place. What Victoria didn't know, what Victoria couldn't have known, was just how capable Kendra was of standing up for herself. Back in her work life, Kendra was more than the Polished, poised professional she appeared to be. She was a problem solver, someone who had built her career by addressing tough situations head-on. Her job as a corporate strategist often required her to play the long game, outmaneuvering opposition with quiet precision. And in that moment, she treated this situation no differently than one of her boardroom battles. She calmly analyzed her options, measured her next steps, and prepared for the inevitable fallout. Passengers continued to cast sideways glances in her direction, some even offering tight-lipped smiles of encouragement. But no one said anything. It wasn't surprising. She'd seen this kind of bystander silence before. Speaking up sometimes meant sharing the burden, and most people weren't willing to risk their peace for someone else's struggle. It didn't upset her. It was just another disappointment she had learned to accept over time. The drinks cart rattled past again, this time handled by a different flight attendant, a younger man with a nervous energy that didn't match Victoria's icy arrogance. He hesitated briefly when he approached Kendra's row, his eyes darting from her to Victoria, who stood a few feet away, pretending not to notice. He asked Kendra if she'd like anything to drink, his voice wavering slightly. Kendra, still collected, gave him a simple nod and politely requested a glass of water. It wasn't about the drinks, after all. It wasn't even about the menu anymore. The issue at hand was much larger than what was, or wasn't, on a piece of laminated paper. Her water arrived a few moments later, and she took a small sip, her sharp gaze now fully fixed on Victoria. By this point, Kendra had fully committed herself to the idea that whatever happened next would be a lesson, not just for Victoria, but for anyone who might think twice before treating someone the way she had been treated today. The minutes crept by, and then something shifted. A quiet ripple of activity stirred in the air, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced. Another flight attendant came out from behind the curtain, this one wearing a name badge that revealed she was the lead on this flight. The woman had a no-nonsense expression and moved with the confidence of someone who was used to putting out fires before they became full-blown crises. She walked briskly down the aisle, her eyes scanning the rows of passengers before settling. On Kendra, the look she exchanged with her was hard to read. More curious than concerned, but definitely aware. "Excuse me, ma'am," the lead attendant said softly, bending down so as not to draw too much attention. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Kendra met her question with calm precision. "Not anymore," she replied smoothly, lifting her chin slightly. "But I think we both know something needs to be addressed." The lead attendant hesitated for a brief moment before nodding. "I'll look into it," she murmured, retreating without further elaboration. She approached Victoria, pulling her aside near the galley as they exchanged hushed words. Victoria's face tightened visibly, blinking in disbelief as her superior spoke in a low, controlled tone. By now, whispers were circulating more freely among the passengers. Some were leaning across aisles to exchange theories, while others typed furiously on their phones, no doubt recounting the events to their own audiences. Kendra noticed the telltale glow of a few cell phone cameras positioned at awkward angles. It wasn't uncommon these days. People loved to capture drama as it unfolded. She didn't mind. If anything, she welcomed the potential visibility it might bring to the situation. Still, no one, not even Kendra, could have anticipated just how far-reaching this moment would become. The call she'd placed earlier wasn't to a friend or family member. It had been to her legal representative, a seasoned attorney who specialized in workplace discrimination and public accountability cases. Kendra knew that what had occurred on this flight wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern that too many people had endured for far too long. And she was in a unique position to do something about it. Back in the galley, Victoria's frustration was beginning to bubble over. Her voice, though still low, carried just enough for Kendra to catch fragments of her rebuttal. "I treat everyone The same. She's exaggerating. This is ridiculous. The lead attendant remained stoic, not betraying whether or not she agreed. But the dynamic between them had shifted. Victoria no longer carried the authoritative confidence she had earlier. Instead, she seemed cornered, her tone icy but defensive in a way that betrayed her unease. Kendra watched it all unfold without lifting a finger. She didn't have to. The wheels were already in motion, and the fallout was inevitable. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath. Kendra could sense the shifting energy, the way conversations had quieted just enough for people to lean in and eavesdrop. The faint rustling of magazines or the tapping of a screen was drowned out by the unspoken collective question filling the air. What was going to happen next? More importantly, what exactly had Kendra done with that phone call? Victoria emerged from the galley a few moments later, her expression colder and harder than before. She had always maintained a certain level of aloofness in her interactions, but now there was something else behind her eyes, a flicker of fear perhaps, or disbelief. She resumed her duties, or at least pretended to. Her movements were too stiff, her steps too deliberate, and the glances she shot toward Kendra's row weren't nearly as subtle as she thought they were. Kendra didn't look away. She didn't blink. She allowed Victoria to feel the weight of her steady gaze, knowing full well how unnerving it must have been. For now, Kendra's part was done. The phone call wasn't about immediate satisfaction. It was about consequences, the kind that unfolded slowly and irreversibly. But as she sat back, seemingly unbothered, Kendra couldn't help but wonder how the rest of the crew was processing all of this. Were they whispering about what had happened, speculating just as much as the passengers, or were they actively preparing for the storm they likely felt brewing? Back in the galley, the lead attendant had gathered the remaining crew, members for a quiet conversation. They huddled in a tight semicircle, their voices low, but their body language tense. A younger attendant, a petite woman named Laura, fidgeted with her hands, her face pale and uncertain. She had witnessed the exchange between Kendra and Victoria earlier, and though she hadn't been directly involved, she knew something had gone wrong. Laura had always admired Victoria for her confidence and professionalism, but today, something about her had felt off. The way she spoke to Kendra had struck a nerve, leaving Laura uneasy in a way she couldn't quite articulate. "Do you think this is going to get escalated?" Laura asked hesitantly, her fingers twisting the edge of her uniform. "I mean, what if someone files a formal complaint?" One of the senior flight attendants, a towering man in his late 40s, gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Don't jump to conclusions," he said firmly, though his furrowed brow betrayed his own doubts. "We just need to keep things running smoothly for the rest of the flight. Whatever this is, we'll deal with it when we land." Laura nodded, but the words did little to settle her nerves. She stole a glance out into the cabin, her eyes landing briefly on Kendra. There was something captivating about her, a quiet strength that Laura couldn't quite put into words. She knew without a doubt that this woman wasn't someone who would just let things slide, and the possibility of what might come from that realization made Laura's stomach churn. Meanwhile, up in first class, a businessman in a crisp suit leaned back in his seat, unbothered by the tension brewing down the aisle. He had noticed the earlier exchange between Kendra and Victoria, but had chosen to remain a passive observer. It wasn't uncommon for him to see these micro moments of rudeness during his frequent travels, though this one felt different. There was a finality to the way Kendra had handled it, a certain quiet power that had unsettled even him. "What's going on back there?" he asked the attendant serving his section, his voice casual but curious. The attendant, who hadn't witnessed the earlier exchange firsthand, gave a polite shrug. "Probably nothing," he said. "Just some drama in coach. It happens more often than you'd think, but his tone lacked conviction, as if even he wasn't fully convinced it was nothing. And then there was the older couple sitting 2 rows behind Kendra, who exchanged concerned whispers as they observed the subtle shift in body language among the crew. The wife, a silver-haired woman with a habit of people-watching, leaned closer to her husband. "It's that woman with the phone," she murmured, tilting her head slightly in Kendra's direction. "She's the one. You saw it too, didn't you? The way that attendant spoke to her?" The husband nodded grimly. "I saw it," he muttered. "And you know what? Good for her. Maybe standing up for herself will make these people think twice." "Still," the wife whispered, lowering her voice even more, "what if they take it out on her? I've seen things like this go bad before." Her concern wasn't unfounded. Kendra wasn't naive about the risks of asserting herself in situations like these. Standing up for yourself could be dangerous, especially when people were used to getting away with questionable behavior. It was easier to pin blame on the person who pushed back than to acknowledge that something in the system was broken. And yet Kendra never regretted choosing principle over comfort. She knew who she was, and that alone was worth more than avoiding a few tense moments. The hours dragged on as the flight inched closer to its destination. Kendra glanced at her phone periodically, though she doubted there'd be any updates until they were safely on the ground. Still, that subtle act, checking her phone, her finger hovering over her contacts, seemed to rattle Victoria every time she caught sight of it. Kendra noticed the way the older woman's jaw tightened, the way she gripped the edges of the cart, a little harder than necessary. It was clear as day that Victoria was unraveling, and Kendra almost felt sorry for her. Almost. At one point, Laura hesitated near Kendra's row, her expression conflicted. She looked as though she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she offered a faint smile, an attempt at solidarity perhaps, and continued on her way. Kendra didn't miss the gesture. It was small, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but it told her enough. Not everyone on this crew agreed with what had happened. Some, like Laura, were caught in the messy grey area between complicity and resistance, unsure of how to act without jeopardizing themselves in the process. And then, just as the seatbelt sign chimed on and the plane began its descent, Kendra's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. The message was brief, but it confirmed what she'd been waiting for. Her contact, someone with significant influence in aviation law and public relations, had already begun laying the groundwork for what came next. It wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about drawing attention to something far bigger. Kendra took a deep breath, calming the slow but steady rhythm of her heartbeat. The landing would mark the end of this particular flight. But for Victoria and the crew, it was just the beginning. The cabin braced for impact, both literal and figurative, with everyone, crew, passengers, and even Kendra herself, wondering exactly how this story would unfold once the wheels hit the tarmac.